This second denial by Peter is kind of weird in his location. It says in Mark, after the first denial is when he went out to the porch. Then the next verse, and a maid saw him again. Maybe the same maid, maybe not. It just says a maid saw him again and began to say to them that stood by, this is one of them. Matthew has it a bit differently. He has his denial. Then the next verse, when he was gone out into the porch, another maid saw him and said to them that were there, this fellow was also Jesus of Nazareth. No mention of him going back, just that he was seen by the maid when he went to the porch. Mark, after the first denial, is when he went to the porch. Maybe they both happened that way. He had his first denial, left to the porch where he was seen, and the woman, or a different maid, spoke to the rest of the group where he already was, and said again, or just repeated and mirrored what the first woman said. This man was with Jesus of Nazareth. What does Luke have? And after a little while, another saw him and said, you are also one of them. Peter goes to the porch. Then I should probably have, after a while, I'm going to combine that he went to the porch right after the first denial, then say, and after a while, from Luke. And then from John, that's where I'll put the fact that he stood by the group again, because after a while, he came back. Peter stood and warmed himself, and there's no mention of a second fire. So I'm going to just believe he came back. Yeah, I'll combine the fact that the others stood by the fire and Peter stood with them warming himself. And that's when he responds to the question. Back to where I have him going to the porch. I'll combine that with Matthew. And when he was gone. And he went. So I use went instead of was gone. Out into the porch is all both. Only went will be from Mark instead of was gone. So the word when I'm not using. Okay, I think I know what I'll say. From Luke, after a little while, when from Matthew, then back to Luke, another saw him. Actually, I'll put another maid saw him. Mark has a maid saw him again, but Matthew and Luke has another. So I'm going to go with that, another maid, instead of a maid saw him again. A similar event occurred. Okay, well that doesn't answer where Peter is at this moment, because in John it says he's warming himself by the fire again. Okay, that's where I'll put the again. Yeah. And Simon Peter again stood and warmed himself. That would fit. And from earlier in John, I would need to say with the servants and the officers who had made a fire of coals. I don't need to say for it was cold. I'll just mention that earlier when they first made the fire. Peter went and sat himself down among the servants and warmed himself at the fire, for it was cold. Yeah, at the end. That's where it needs to be. Luke, and after a little while, another saw him. Mark, and a maid saw him. So the and is from Mark. Matthew, no and. So just Mark and Luke, and now just Luke, after a little while, another is in Matthew. Now I'm going to mention maid. The word is in italics in Matthew, but it's actually written there in Mark. The word is also there in Mark. Saw him. That's Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And said, you are also one of them. So before she says that to Peter, or before they say that to Peter, I'm going to have that she mentioned to the rest of the people and said to them that were there. I'm going to have again from Mark and from John that he's standing by the fire. And Simon Peter again stood and warmed himself with the servants and the officers who had made the fire of coals. So, and Simon Peter. That's where I have to start. So, and Peter is also in John, earlier, verse 18. Luke, and Peter said, so I'm not going to use that one. Mark, a maid saw him, began to say to them, this is one of them. Matthew, so no, just the two places in John. Peter again stood. I need to say with the servants and the officers. So with. Where's a with? Matthew. Another maid saw him and said to them that were there, this fellow was with Jesus. Okay, there's a with. What does it say in Mark? This is one of them. Luke. You are also of them. John. They said, therefore, are not you also one of his disciples? Only Matthew has the statement, this fellow was with Jesus of Nazareth. The rest says, you're one of them. I think I'm going to go with the majority witness now. So I'm just going to not have with Jesus of Nazareth. And I can use the with here. So stood. I have to say that he stood with the people. Stood is from both locations. I don't want to have it say again stood, because before he was sitting. He's again warming himself. Okay, I'm going to have warmed himself and stood with the servants and officers. So first warmed himself. That's from John 18:18. 18:25. And I don't think that's in Luke or Mark or Matthew. No, so just John. 2 places in John. And stood with. And stood. From just before warmed himself in John 18:18. And 18:25. And also the same from the beginning. And stood. With, from Matthew, the servants and officers. There, I already used stood, so I'm just going to there. Who had made a fire. Of coals, and warmed themselves. And after a little while, another maid saw him. And Simon Peter again warmed himself and stood with the servants and officers there, who had made a fire of coals and warmed themselves. I don't need to mention that it was cold. It was already mentioned earlier. I still haven't used beneath. I had a thought about that. It mentions outside twice. The point of view of the reader was focused on Peter. Then we switched to what's happening with Jesus. Then in verse 69, this is Matthew, it goes back to Peter, so it makes sense to say, now Peter sat outside in the palace again. So that you know, okay, we're thinking about some other event right now. And I think that's what's going on in Mark. Verse 66, and as Peter was beneath in the palace, we're switching from talking about Jesus and imagining what he's going through to now imagining what Peter's going through. So that is a transition word, beneath. Maybe I can use that to transition our point of view to thinking about Peter for the second denial. If I say, and after a little while another maid saw him, then I could say, and as Peter was beneath, he again warmed himself and stood with. So I have to have a he. In Matthew, he denied with an oath. I could use that he. Mark, he denied it again. Luke, Peter said, I'm not. So Peter denied. So I have the option between using one of these he's there. John, he denied it. Okay, so there are he in Matthew, Mark, and John, but Luke, Peter denied it. So I think I can do that. And as Peter was beneath. So this and, I'm going to combine here. So this will be Mark and John. I'll put as before his name. I'll leave Simon, but I'm going to combine Peter. Was beneath. I have to name his location. Now the he, I'll use from Matthew, just to show that I'm grabbing it from somewhere. and I still have the Peter for when he denies. So now it reads, and after a little while, another maid saw him. And as Simon Peter was beneath... Oh, wait. I can't just start with the maid saw him. Because we're leaving from speaking about Jesus. I need to start with, and after a little while, as Simon Peter was beneath. Yeah. And after a little while, as Simon Peter was beneath, another maid saw him. And he again warmed himself, and stood with the servants and officers there, who had made a fire of coals and warmed themselves. That is the best. Now it's complete.